Essentially, what I want to do is talk about, how is light defined, right? And what do we do to measure it? Um, there's lots of ways to kind of evaluate our light, and we're going to kind of go through some of them. This class is going to be a three-part series. I've broken it down. We're going to talk about the foundational aspects of light this week. 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be going over some more in-depth information about light, including our white balance, including some of the ways that we measure light. And then finally, in the third week, we're going to be looking at some really intensive comparisons and how we control light in a multiple light set, how we measure that light. So what methods of measuring light do we have? First of all, the eye. And as a trained photographer, you'll see that we can look at a scene and say that scene looks really flat. If you're not trained to look at it with your eye, we all just kind of look at scenes, whether it be a landscape or a wildlife scene, and say, wow, that looks pretty nice. And we just expect our camera to capture it. The problem with that is you'll see later on here tonight that our cameras have a limited dynamic range, and we're going to talk in class 2 about how we're going to measure each person's individual camera's dynamic range and its capabilities. But I get ahead of myself a little bit here. So the built-in camera meters are one way of measuring it. I personally use a light meter. I use a Sekonic to measure most of my scenes, unless I'm actually working in the field, and sometimes then I'll just rely on the camera light meter, but understanding what its limitations are. Is intensity all that's important? We talk about terms like warm light, harsh light, soft light, diffuse shadow, and shadow. There's an old saying that the artistry and the soul and the emotion of an image is in the shadows. And so shadows become very, very important to us. Things like harsh light, what is the difference between harsh light and soft light? We'll deal with all of those terminologies. And I kind of throw some quotes in here periodically. Light thinks it travels faster than anything, but it was wrong. No matter how fast light travels, he finds darkness has always got there first and is waiting for it. So as much as we like to look at the lights and the light that we're capturing, I'm going to suggest to you that oftentimes we need to be looking and paying more attention to the shadow. What we can do, what does light do? If it dispels darkness, defines, shapes, isolates, creates mood. All of the shadows and light that we capture do all of these functions for us, and it develops that emotion. It creates that 3 dimensions that we need, and it attracts interest. There's nothing worse than, in my mind, than what I consider to be a very flat image. So, light defines, it defines the shape, it defines and isolates. And what is isolation? How to create it? How do we find it? How do we isolate something with light? Can camera create it? Camera controls, depth of field, and camera movement. So when we look at an image, I want you to start looking at your images differently, because light really does define that image. I want you to explore the shadows and explore where the maker of that image has led your eye. And in this case, it's leading, even though we have a fairly compelling necklace on this young model, our eyes are what is very compelling. So the light is leading us through that triangle and through that geometry up to the model's eyes. So it creates mood, whether it be kind of a seductive mood, and it creates a balance and focuses the viewer's attention, right? So a Harley Quinn model that we had in that, that did a terrific job of that. But the light we set, specifically, I set as an example of trying to create drama and emotion. And light can create leading lines. So, here the balance is we've got a sun that's setting in the background, and we still need to shoot this bride. And I shot a very low angle, so we have the shadows of all that sun coming through, and all those leading lines leading through to the model are an interesting component of the image, but it also leads us for a very challenging thought process as to how do we create that in our camera. So it develops emotion. Light is all that we have to capture. If we're not studying light, we're not really studying anything in our imagery. It attracts interests. And how do we measure light? Knowing how your digital camera meters light, in my mind, is kind of critical. And if I'm going too fast for anybody, let me know, kind of wave a hand, and Steve will yell at me or something in the background. But I want you to kind of evaluate things in a different way. So knowing how your digital camera is recording things is going to become kind of the essence of this first class. Metering is the brains behind how your camera determines the shutter speed, aperture, based on lighting conditions and ISO speed. The metering is done in camera, and unfortunately, many people rely on our cameras too much to actually capture the image. We put it in program mode and spray and pray. We put it in aperture priority and just hope that we have enough dynamic range to capture the image, all of which is where we would like to see you get past. So when we start to talk about your metering in the camera has a fairly intensive thing that it needs to do. Whether we're using partial metering or evaluative or matrix or center weighted or in spot metering, each of those situations require the camera and the electronics in the camera to evaluate the image in a different way, and sometimes correctly and sometimes, frankly, incorrectly. And so we're going to talk about some of that tonight. And here's just a couple of examples of center weighted, partial metering, and spot metering. In order to accurately expose a greater range of subject lighting reflective combinations, most cameras feature several options for metering, and that's fine. The question that we have to be able to answer in our mind, and the reason we need to be smarter than our camera, is we need to choose the appropriate scenario for each one of these metering options, because there are times when center weighted is going to give you a very poor result with your image. And spot metering, on the other hand, although more accurate, it's a much smaller metering zone, may in fact give you just as bad of a result depending on the scene that you're shooting. So we need to understand that a little bit, and we're going to get into that. So this really kind of refers to the widest regions contribute the most towards the exposure calculation, because your meter and your sensor in your camera are much more susceptible to light on the higher end of your histogram, the brighter whites. So it actually incorporates more and contributes more to the metering effect. So bright backgrounds versus a darker foreground, and using something like this with a metering matrix can give you false positives. So partial and spot metering give the photographer far more control, but you still need to kind of understand your settings, and this is all going to come down to being able to understand light and the three parameters that we have to control light. And while I'm going through this, Steve, have you calculated anything as far as where?
Yeah, so we've got, I would say definitely heavy focus, intermediate. Probably 2/3 of people have jumped on and said intermediate. And then probably a quarter people have replied beginner. And we've got a couple of advanced. And I got a shout out to Liz for dropping Ansel Adams in there. So
right.
Liz says she learned from a student of Ansel Adams, and I absolutely respect that shout out. So.
Well, cool. I mean, I got to spend a couple days with Ansel back in the day. I've been at this for a while, and was an amazing individual. So I'm going to kind of gear this. I'm going to try to make certain that we still talk to our beginners, but I also want to gear this towards more of our immediate and advanced shooters as well. And one of the things I'm asking everybody to do, if you haven't done it already, is to have a camera kind of at your fingertips here, because in a little bit we're going to be picking up our cameras, and we're going to be looking at a couple of things on that camera. And I'm going to be talking in more generic terms, but I'm going to ask you to kind of sort some things out here that we talk about. So one of the most common applications of partial metering is a portrait of someone who is backlit. Metering off their face can help avoiding the subject looking underexposed. And we'll talk about specific situations where that happens. So center metering is common default because it's, you know, copes well with the bright sky and darker landscape. The metering systems have gotten much better. The metering points have gotten much better. So this is just saying that we can rely a little bit more on our cameras than we could years ago. And, you know, in my mind, I use center weighted metering is very predictable, but I use spot metering predominantly if I'm out doing things, and I'll show you why as we move along. So if you're a beginner, I'm going to say that a center weighted metering is very predictable, and it's probably the best metering option for you. As you become a little more advanced and a little more attuned to what the metering systems are doing, then I'm going to suggest that we may want to be moving off into spot metering. So just a quick analysis or quick, you know, diagram about what our lighting does. So if we have our light bulb and lighting our subject, the sphere off to the side, we have an incident light that can be measured using an incident light meter. An incident light meter actually measures the light that is hitting the subject versus your camera, and your camera meter is using what we call reflective light. So we're actually trying to get a meter reading off of something that has light reflecting off of it, coming back to our camera. And the camera meter is trying to analyze that light from a reflected surface rather than actually metering the light that is hitting the subject. So as an example, had I taken, and I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but if this was a race car out on a racetrack, and I held my light meter up while I'm sitting in the stands of the you know, the crowd, and held the light meter up and backwards so that the same light that is hitting this car is hitting my light meter, I have an exact light meter reading that I need for that car. If I try to use the in-camera light meter reading, I have to wait till the car is basically stationary and try to use spot metering and meter off of that reflective car to get a light meter reading for that reflective light. Not very practical. But this light meter will give me, an incident light meter will give me the exact amount of light that is hitting that car. And if I set my camera up for the exposure that my light meter is giving me, I will have a perfect exposure. So, you know, somebody says, well, it's not actually the light that's hitting the car. And I will say that, you know, the sun is 1,000,000 miles away, or, you know, 100 million miles away, forget what the distance is. And, you know, the distance between the crowd and your car is, you know, a couple hundred yards. So in essence, this is metering the same amount of light that's hitting my subject. It's one of the reasons that we love using incident meters, because it's giving me a true recording of the amount of light that's hitting my subject. So, you know, they measure reflective light, and that's the biggest flaw with all in-camera light meters. And the bigger problem is that, you know, objects reflect a different percentage of light. You know, is it a piece of black velvet, or is it a black metal that has a metallic finish to it that's going to reflect light very, very, very effectively? So all of those things are going to affect how much light we will be able to capture. And, you know, in the printing industry, we talk about a standardized ink density, which reflects 18% of the incident light. And however, cameras seldom are able to adhere to that. A camera default has somewhere between a 10 to 18% reflective for middle tone grays. Again, probably more than what most people want to know. However, it's important to know that we've got some variability as to how that camera is actually reading that reflective quality of the subject. And our cameras are all trying to bring whatever the subject is to an 18% gray and measure that reflectance of that light that's hitting that 18% gray. So, you know, it's essentially what we call middle gray. And our cameras are getting so much better that they're really pretty good at this now. But unfortunately, some scenes just kind of beat the camera system. They don't know how to handle it. And that's where we need to be smarter than our camera again. So you look at the white dove in the snow, or a black dog sitting on a pile of charcoal. How do you measure that? I will guarantee you that if you do a black dog sitting in a pile of charcoal and you use your reflective meter in your camera, you're going to end up with a gray dog sitting on a pile of gray charcoal. It's not going to be a black dog. If you look at the white dove sitting in snow, you are going to have a gray dove sitting in a dirty snow pile, all right? And that's just because our metering system tries to make that 18% gray. So this is, again, looking at, may try to create an histogram with a primary peak in the midtones. And, you know, here's our histogram. And I'm kind of rushing through this because I want to get through to a bunch of other things. But you understand that how a histogram works. And we're going to talk a little bit more about histograms in a few moments. But here's a basic histogram. And our camera is going to try to build a mid-tone peak with an 18% gray. That's what the light meter is going to try to do. Is that correct for an image? No, because if in fact I had that black dog sitting on black charcoal, the histogram should be down here, should be peaked on this far left-hand edge. If I had that white dog in snow, the histogram should be peaked way over on this right-hand side here. So all of that just goes to say that there are some problems with our in-camera metering systems. And what I'm going to do is show you how to work your way around that, solve those problems, and understand histograms better, understand light better, and become a better photographer. So this is just a couple examples. This is an older Sekonic. This I think is it's the 358. And it shows you that you can change your ISO. It gives you an f-stop, it gives you a shutter speed, and I'm shooting and recording daylight light here. So without kind of going into the transmission and how we're going to use that, we'll talk a little bit more as that goes on. Now, exposure values, EVs. Not many people really understand EVs, and I don't understand why, because it's kind of one of the foundations of photography. It essentially is a stop. So some people will refer to it as a stop, and it actually is a stop. And the reason that we want to know stops of light is that our camera has a limited capacity for gathering stops of light. We need to know how to measure how many stops of light we have, and we need to know what our ratios are between those stops of light, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about that as we finish up here too. So in order to understand EVs or stops, you must first understand light. And if you would, it'd be nice if light worked in a linear scale, but it doesn't. Unfortunately, it works in a logarithmic scale. So if you quarter the amount of light that reaches the subject, it's twice as far. So in other words, if you double the distance, you get a quarter the amount of light, which is the inverse square or logarithmic scale. Without going into the logarithmic formula for all of this, if you just understand that when you have a very foundation, if you move a light twice the distance from your subject than what it was, you're only going to get a quarter of the amount of light. And we're gonna show that basically in class 3. We're gonna evaluate that a lot more in detail. I just wanted to kind of give you an understanding of where we're going with the whole class. And so these are stops, and these are shutter stops or EVs. And when we talk about EVs, we don't really talk about individual stops. We talk about this distance between the 1/8 and 1/15 of a second is a stop. We talk about the fact that between 1/8 of a second and 1/30 of a second, we have 2 stops or 2 EVs. The same here, if we go from 1/8 to 1/20, I can count the stops, 1, 2, 3, 4 stops. And it's fairly easy on our shutter stops because it basically is just doubling. So 1/8 of a second to a 15th, a 30th, a 60th, 120, 250, 500, 1,000, 2,000. So each and every stop of light is essentially doubling my shutter speed. And you know, the inverse if we were to go back this way. Now f-stops are the ones that everybody has trouble remembering because it's just a little bit more interesting. Most people don't have to worry about things down here. They start at maybe a 2.8 lens, and then we go to an f4. And somebody says, well, that's only one stop of light between 2.8 and f4. And you're right. And if I were to buy a lens that has an f4 lens and talk to Steve or Mark over at Delaware Camera, and I buy an f4 lens, that f4 lens may cost me $1,000. And then when I decide that I want to buy that 2.8 lens, that 2.8 lens is going to cost me roughly $2,500. So I always call our light stops buying light for that reason, because I can, with some more money, go ahead and buy that f2 lens or an f1.4 or an f1.24 or 1.2. But each time I go down this scale, this direction, it's costing me more money, all right, to buy this. And with our current technology of cameras, a lot of people will stop here at the f4 or the 5.6 and buy that light on the higher ISO range, which was our next scale. And our ISO range essentially doubles, even though we're at 60th to 100. Once we go to 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. So if I was, for example, buying that f4 lens and I had an ISO 100, and I said, well, yes, but I'd really like to go ahead and spend that extra $1,500 and buy that 2.8 lens, then all it's doing is allowing me to go to ISO 60. I've bought one stop of light. So essentially I can drop my ISO by dropping that f-stop, and we'll show you when we incorporate our full scale here. And this is all about being a balancing act and what the criteria is. So here's the chart that we're going to spend quite a bit of time with. And the next chart that I show you may confuse you a little bit, but this is the chart that I've taught with for years. And essentially we have our ISO range on the top. So we have 100, 200, 400, 800, 16, all the way up to 25.6. Now, I'm old enough that I remember when we couldn't buy anything more than ISO 200, right? It wasn't until about
Hey,
1970.
Doug, I'm going to jump in quick.
Sure.
Your audio got a little distorted last minute there.
Right. Still there.
Yeah, we're still there. It's a digital sound. I don't know if you need to reconnect your mic. Thank you for everyone who jumped in there. I wasn't sure if it was me, so I was trying to message Mark over there, and
Is that better now?
No, you're still garbled on it.
Still garbled. Well, I'm gonna exit for a second. And I'm going to just check to see what's going on. Is that better?
No.
Let me switch over mics here then. Is that better now?
Not as clean as it was before, but the garbled is gone.
Okay. Not sure what happened with my my external mic, but this is just using the internal mic on my computer here. So if you have trouble, let me know. All right. So what I really wanted to talk about was this chart. And this is kind of what I consider the Bible of photography. And so as we increase the ISO, you'll see that we get more light. So more light can be had by going from ISO 400 to 800. As I said, when I first started shooting, we had ISO 100 essentially. We essentially got ISO 400 in about 1971 or so. And then about 72 or 3, we figured out how to do the chemicals in the darkroom so that we could get ISO 1600. But everything beyond that was just unheard of. We didn't have the capabilities to do that for quite some time. So we were really limited to a very small ISO range, you know, back in the day, so to speak. Yes, it dates me. So on our shutter scale here, and understand that I started off at my slower shutter speed, and I go to a faster shutter speed, meaning that my more light is in this direction from right to left. The slower my shutter speed, the more light my sensor has to capture. And if I'm down to the 15th of a second, that shutter is open for a 15th of a second, and my sensor has that much more time to capture lights, thus that arrow going this way, more light. The contributing factors with shutter is the lens length in millimeters, meaning that we need to use our kind of standard rule that we've had forever, which was that we need to have our shutter speed equal to 2 times the focal length of our lens. And so if I had a 200 millimeter lens, that means that if I was hand holding that camera, I need to have that shutter speed at 1/400th of a second, all the way up here. And if I had a 400 millimeter lens, I would need to have that all the way up at a 1/1600th of a second, all the way up at this side. So that's a handheld shot. And obviously if we're using a tripod or a gimbal, we can vary that. And more recently with our mirrorless cameras, we're going to things like image stabilization, not only in our lens, but say with the Panasonic or Olympus, we have 5-axis image stabilization built right into the sensor. So the sensor itself is floating on a image stabilizing platform. So that rule of 2 times the focal distances doesn't necessarily apply to some of our current technology, but not a bad thing to remember and keep in the back of your head that if you have that longer lens, you better keep your shutter speed moving up in this direction up here. And the other factor for shutter speed is our subject speed and or movement. Are we dealing with a bird in flight? We need to have 2,000ths of a second or higher. If we're dealing with an Hansgate where we're on a tripod and it's not really big, we should shoot 30 per second or 50 per second and not have a problem at all. So this is the situation that we need to evaluate when we look at our shutter chart. Our f-stops, we start off at f1.0. Not too many people have those lenses. We go all the way out to 1.4, 2, 2.8. But many of you, if you're buying kit lenses, you don't even start to have an f-stop availability until you get to f4 or f5.6. And with a zoom lens, many of those f-stops are actually change as you zoom your lens. So it may start off at an f4 at say a 50 millimeter lens, but as it goes out to a 200, it may be all the way up to 6.3 or 7.1. And you can see that on the front of your lens. If you look at your lens on from the very front of your lens, you'll be able to see it'll say f, say 4.5 to 5.6, or it'll say just f4. F4 is a fixed f-stop, a single non-adjustable f-stop as you zoom. So there's something else to consider. So when we start to look at this chart, more light in our f-stops means that we need to open up that aperture more. That lens needs to become bigger. The aperture in the lens needs to be a larger hole. With that larger hole, we have a change in the depth of field. So the larger the hole, the smaller the aperture number, the shallower depth of field that we have capable of gathering at that f2. Now, back in the day when Ansel Adams was shooting, he didn't really have too much to worry about because his cameras were all at f32 and f64 way up here on the scale. It was rare for him to shoot anywhere down into the f16 range, especially with large format cameras. Those were f64s and f32s, pinholes type holes in our f-stops. And is everybody still with me? Because I can't see anything on my attendance. So
we are with you, Doug. Thank you.
Okay. So just didn't want to be talking to my computer here and have nobody around. I do enough talking to myself. So what I'm going to do is jump out of my full screen here and jump over to sharing something that I want to get to here. So let's go to my Photoshop. And you'll see that I have essentially the same chart up for you, except that what I've done to make things a little bit easier is that I've flipped my shutter and f-stops so that going to the right is always going to be more light. And this chart is kind of the foundation of everything that we do. Now, some people will call, in an exposure triangle, and they will essentially, if I were to take and put a new layer on here and grab a paintbrush and they're going to stretch this ISO to this bar, and they're going to change the shutter to this bar, and they're going to put the f-stop on the bottom. And I always found that to be not beneficial to people. So what I've always taught is that we're going to buy light on one of these scales, starting with an exposure. So if I give you an exposure, and let's just start off with Sunny 16. So Sunny 16 is an old rule that we used, still prevalent today. In fact, I used it yesterday shooting the KC-135s and F-35s that flew over the Buffalo area. And Sunny 16 is a standard rule you can use if you're out on a sunny day and you want an exposure. You can just set your camera up for ISO 100. You can set it up for 1/100th of a second and shoot it at f16. And that is the Sunny 16 rule. So if you look at my chart now, I've pinpointed those three determining factors. And I said, okay, I'm out yesterday shooting my KC 135. And before I even stepped out of my car, I set my exposure. And I took exposure after I stepped out of the car to check it, looked at it on the camera and said, that's fine. And I never looked at my leg meter. I never pulled the leg meter out to evaluate anything. And here's how easy it is to do that. I made a decision that I really wanted my my aircraft to be shot at 1/2000th of a second. All right. So this is where I want to be. I don't want to be at 1/100th of a second. I want to be at 1/2000th of a second. So what does that mean? It really means that I've lost 1, 2, 3, 4 1/3 stops of light. So if I show you that and turn on my scale, you'll see that I have 4 1/3 stops less light by going to 2/1000ths of a second and getting off of that 1/100th of a second. So why did I make that decision? Well, I got a moving plane. I'm hand holding my camera, and even though it's a slow moving plane, it's not a hummingbird. I still need a 2/1000th of a second in order to capture that shot. All right. So now, because I know that I lost 4 stops of light, all we really need to do is figure out where I'm going to buy that light back. Okay. Does that make sense? And I'm hoping everybody is saying yes. All right. So you have to buy that back that light somewhere. Now the question is where. I know that I need 2/1000ths. I know that I need to buy 4 1/3 stops of light back. Well, I'm at f16. Do I really need f16? If I'm shooting planes and they're passing by and they're a 1/4 of a mile away, and my subjects are all a 1/4 of a mile away, or within that range, then maybe I don't need f16. I could simply have said, let's come down here and make a new indicator, and let me just change my color and say, let's buy it all back on my f-stops. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4 1/3. So I can come down to 3.5. Now, 3.5 is not necessarily where I would want to be for an f-stop. So I go, I really don't like that thought process. Maybe I'm only going to back it off to 5.6. All right. So 5.6 is f5.6 is still going to give me a decent depth of field for planes that are flying in formation and they're all a fair distance away from me. I can shoot at 5.6 and have them all sharp. That means that I took and bought 3 stops of light back on my f-stop scale. Well, I needed to buy 4 1/3. So if I'm going to choose 5.6, then I also need to come up here and I need to buy more light by going to 250th of a second, or ISO 250. All right. Now, there's the question, you could certainly, if a Sunny 16 was the proper exposure and I wanted to go to 2/1000ths of a second, I could simply just go to 5.6 and 250th of ISO 250, and my exposure will be dead perfect. I don't have to pull out a light meter. I don't have to do anything. I know that this exposure, this ISO 250, 2/1000ths of a second, and 5.6 is the exact same exposure as what I had for Sunny 16. And that's the real crux of this, is because I don't need to rely on a meter anymore. I don't need to rely on anything. All I do is change my ISO and my f-stop and know that and count it off in my head. And it's pretty easy to count in my head. I go, let's see, I was at 1/100th of a second. Well, if I go to 125, 250, 500, 1,000, 2,000, that's 4 stops. Come back down to my 1/100th, which is 1/3 of a stop. I know that I need 4 1/3. And now I can count out my 4 1/3 here. But here's the problem, is not everybody is as good as holding this visually in their head and taking this chart and making sense of it, correct? There's some people out there that are probably shaking their head going, it's not going to happen, Doug, right? I'm not going to do that. Well, here's the beauty of it. If in fact you have your camera, and there's a supposition here. So if your camera is set at, and let me just grab my tool here and throw this in here for a second. If your camera is set at 1/3 stop increments, which is what most cameras are set up at, all right? If your camera is set up for 1/3 of a stop increments, if you pick up your camera right now and hold it in your hand, what I want you to do is put your camera in manual mode. And in manual mode, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our dial that changes the shutter speed. I want you to set your camera up so that it is at Sunny 16, ISO 100. I want you to set shutter speed at 1/100th of a second. And I want you to set your f-stop up for 5.6. I'm going to give you a minute to do that, but ISO 100, shutter speed 1/100th of a second, f-stop is f16. I'm sorry, f16 is our f-stop. That's Sunny 16. So, assuming that we have our camera set that way, now what I want you to do is I want you to take your shutter dial. Now, you know, every camera is a little different. Some have the shutter speed on the front dial if you're a Canon person. Some have it on the back wheel. Some of it have it on a back dial. But whatever dial that you have on your camera that adjusts the shutter speed, I want you to go from 1/100th of a second and start counting the clicks as your dial moves. And I want you to count the clicks until you get to 2,000. And I will tell you that it is 13 clicks. Correct? You went from shutter speed 1/100th of a second to shutter speed 1/2000th of a second with 13 clicks of that dial. And I see Kathy Swain out there. Kathy, tip your head up, shake your head and say, yes, I managed to do that, right? So in 13 clicks, you took it from 1/100th of a second to 1/2000th of a second, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to buy some of those clicks back on my ISO. So I want you to take your ISO dial and buy 4 clicks on the ISO. And your ISO should read 2/50th of a second. Or ISO 250, I'm sorry, I keep saying 2/50th of a second, but ISO 250. All right, so you bought 4 clicks back on your ISO. So we only need to buy 9 more clicks on our f-stop. So now take the f-stop dial and rotate your f-stop dial 9 clicks. And 9 clicks so that you get more light. And you will find that you are at f5.6. That is the exact same exposure as Sunny 16. So when I stepped out of my car to take that shot of the plane, I knew that all I needed to do was go to Sunny 16 and adjust my f-stops accordingly. So one of the things that I'm going to ask all of you to do between now and next 2 weeks when we have our next class is I want you to become absolutely totally familiar with each of those dials that adjust your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed. And I want you to be able to close your eyes and rotate that dial and know whether you are getting more light or less light by the rotation of that dial. So if you have a wheel on the back of your camera, when you spin that wheel to the right, if you're a Canon user, it should give you more light. If you spin it to the left, it should give you less light. So less light means that on the f-stop, it is going to go higher and higher f-stop when you spin to the left. Now, every camera system is slightly different, both in the rotation of the dial and in the direction that you need to move it in order to get less light. But all you really need to do is think about that back dial. And as you're spinning that back dial, if it's changing your shutter speed, is it going to a slower shutter speed or is it going to a faster shutter speed? If it's going to a slower shutter speed, it means you're getting more light. So if that is rotating to the left and you are getting a slower shutter speed, you are going to get more light when you rotate to the left. And just the opposite. So I'm going to pick on Faye. I see Faye sitting here. Faye, what camera do you have? Can we turn Faye's on, Steve? Or can her turn her audio on? Ah, there you are.
Hi, I have a Canon 77D.
Okay. And Faye, so you've got a dial on the back of your camera, correct?
That's correct.
There's a wheel. And
Yes.
the wheel changes your f-stop?
Yes, it does.
And if you move your wheel to the left, which way does your f-stop go?
I usually do it automatically, so let me just see.
I understand.
To the left, it comes lower. If I move it to the right, it goes higher.
Okay, so in your f-stop, when you want more light, you need to rotate your dial to the left, correct?
Correct, and have the lowest number possible.
Right. And when you move it to the right, you're going to get less light.
Correct. It narrows the aperture and the number goes higher.
Right. And then on the front dial,
Yes.
you have your shutter speed, correct?
Correct.
And if you rotate that dial to the right, clockwise, do you get the shutter speed goes lower or higher?
Higher.
Okay. So once again, if you want more light, you need to go to the left. You need to go counterclockwise.
Right. I need a slower shutter speed to let more light in.
Exactly. Right. So each and every one of you, again, it matters not what camera system you have. You need to figure out, hold your camera, practice with it, understand that in my mind, I'm closing my eyes and I'm imagining Faye's camera and saying, if I want to get more light on my shutter speed, I need to take the front dial and rotate it counterclockwise, go to the left, and I will get more light. If I want to go to the right, I'm going to get less light, faster shutter speed. If I go to the back dial on her camera and rotate to the left, I'm going to get more light. If I rotate to the right, I'm going to get less light. So what I see often, and I see this all the time, I go to venues, I go to, there's club meetings and there's people, and I see a lot of spinning of dials, right? I just see people out there going, oh, let's spin the dials. It's not working in this direction. Try spinning it the other direction. And what I want you to do is become very, very quick and efficient at being able to adjust your camera and know that by moving that front dial to the right, my shutter speed's going up. or if I move it to the left, my shutter speed is going down. If I rotate that wheel on the back, my f-stop is going up. It's going down if I rotate to the left. Everybody should get very, very familiar with that and be able to do this very, very quickly. Because if we go back to just this scenario that I've laid out for you, if I was at Sunny 16 and before I left my car, I said, well, I'll just set it at ISO 100. I'm going to shoot at 1/100th of a second, and I'm going to shoot at 16, f16, Sunny 16. Now I go, boy, I know a plane is coming. I really need to shoot this plane at a faster shutter speed than 1/100th of a second. So I just take my front in phase world. She's going to take her front dial and she's going to rotate her front dial to the right. And she's going to count the clicks as she goes. And when she gets to 2,000ths of a second, 13 clicks later, she is at 2,000ths of a second. Now all she needs to do is buy those 13 clicks back. She knows that if she goes to her back wheel and she wants to get more light and buy that light back, she has to rotate that dial to the left. So she's going to rotate that dial to the left 9 clicks. And she's going to be at f5.6. And then she turns around and says, I just need to change my ISO. And I forget on that camera whether you have to hold the button to change ISO or whether you do it with a dial. But however, you're just going to add another 4 clicks on your ISO and you will be at the exact same exposure.
Doug, is that full stops or would it count in thirds as well?
We're counting it as thirds. So,
okay.
So in reality, that's why I'm saying 13 stops. You see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
Okay.
So all I did in my head was multiply 4 times 3, came up with 12, and added the third is 13.
Yeah, so currently my camera, the ISO is set up on the full stops, like 100, 200, 400. I don't have the third, so I might need to change that to follow the math.
Yeah, in your settings,
yeah.
right? Now, or you can, you know, in your head, you can say if you don't want to change your ISOs, like, you know, for example, my Fuji doesn't have third stops on ISO. A Fuji only has full stops. But I know that when I go from ISO 100 to 200, I can count 3, right? Because it's 3/3. So let's kind of take this one step further. So what I want to do is, most people don't understand that they actually have an exposure meter in their camera. I don't know how many times I have taught basic photography classes and I say, now look through the viewfinder and tell me what the light meter is reading. And they go, there is no light meter. And I go, yeah, there is. And that light meter for a Canon looks like this. You'll have a center point. All right, this is a standard exposure. And then you have this little indicator down below, which is showing you what the meter is reading. Now, what the meter is reading is dependent on a whole bunch of things, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But this meter is reading that it is negative. You see the little negative here, right? It is negative 1/3 of a stop. So if this was Faye's camera and she was looking through the viewfinder and looking at a scene, and her light meter was in this position, so this little indicator down here was at negative 1/3 of a stop, she knows that all she has to do is rotate her back dial 1 click to the left, and that will increase her f-stop and bring her right back to exposure 0. Or she could go to her front dial and go 1 click to the left, and it will decrease her shutter speed by 1/3 and bring her right back to 0.
Mm-hmm.
Does this make sense? All right. Now, the beauty of this is that in the camera, they are telling you what those stops are. They're not telling you, they're not giving you this chart, right? They are giving you stops. So the light meter in your camera is measuring -1, -2, -3 stops from the perfect exposure, or +1, +2, +3 stops from the perfect exposure. So in manual mode, when you look in the viewfinder and you push your shutter to, button halfway down to get a meter reading, and it is, imagine that it's here at -2. That means you need 6 clicks of more light. Now you can get those 6 clicks of more light on any one of these scales, right? You can buy the light on the ISO, you can buy it on shutter, or you can buy it on f-stop. But you need 6 clicks more light to get a -2 light meter reading to 0. If you know that in order to get more light, you need to rotate your dial to the left on either the front or the rear dial, then you can just simply rotate to the dial on the back 3 clicks and rotate the dial on the front 3 clicks, and you know that your meter will be at 0, and you don't even have to look at your camera anymore and look at the light meter. You know that you have the perfect exposure. Does that make sense? Okay, so every camera system is slightly different. Nikon doesn't give you the numbers, right? They make it a little more interesting for you. They just give you little dashes, and they say this is negative and this is positive, and oh my goodness, there's a bunch of little dashes in here, right? And so now you have to kind of look at the dashes and count the dashes, or you will just understand that if you're on the negative side, you can rotate your dial 1, 2, 3, 4 clicks to get more light, and it will bring it to 0. If you're on the right-hand side, you're going to rotate your camera dials to the right to cut down on the light, and it'll bring it back to 0. So for the next class, what I want everybody to be able to do is to be able to efficiently move that camera around and point it at different subjects. Look through the lens of your camera and be able to indicate the which way you're going to rotate that dial in order to bring your light meter reading from a negative position to 0 or from a positive position to 0. Does that make sense? All right. This class is easier to teach when I've got people in house, because I walk around to everybody's camera and make certain that we've got the dials right the way we want, and I show you which way you want to go. But in reality, this comes down to practicing at home anyway, so you really need to understand that which way your particular camera is going to make the rotation of those dials to give you more or less light. Okay? So, that being said, how do we use this? We use it in a lot of different ways. One of the things that we do is we start to evaluate images. All right, so we take and decide that we decide that we need to meter an image. And we already talked a little bit about the fact that our meter itself is not great at metering an entire scene, because if we were using matrix metering, the metering would be using the whole image, and how is the whole image metered? And I brought this image up to show you essentially what the camera does. So when your camera is trying to meter this image, and and it's trying to get an evaluation of what the proper exposure of this image is. Essentially what it does is it takes and does a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to just desaturate it, because in reality, the light meter system in your camera does not care about color. It cares about 50% gray, right? It's going to try to make everything 50% gray. The next thing it's going to do is it's essentially going to just blur the image. So it's going to take and blur the image to something that looks like that. And that's how, this is what your light meter is seeing. So if you were to use a matrix metering system that is measuring a point of light, let's just say that I had a point of light here, and I had a point of light here, and I had a point of light here, and another point of light here, and another point of light here. And it is using this matrix metering system. This one is almost in pure black. This one is half and half. This is in pure black. This is actually in gray, and this is half and half in gray and black. So you can see that the metering system is going to have trouble trying to meter this. And therefore, am I going to get the proper exposure? So when I look back through my meter, am I going to get a proper exposure when I go to expand, my standard exposure? Is it going to come to 0? And the answer to that is, in this particular case, it's going to have trouble getting you proper exposure, because there is probably more black than there is accurate exposure. I'm going to tell you that what's going to happen is your meter is going to read this as being dark, and it's going to give you an exposure meter reading that is down here at -1 or -2. You're going to adjust your exposure to go back to 0. And when you do that, it is going to essentially, hold on here one second. I can do this quickly. It is essentially going to do this to your image. If you use the metering that was in the camera, because it is metering so much of that black area, when you use your meter to do this shot, and this is assuming this wasn't shot with flash, this was shot with, say, continuous light, it's going to blow out the highlights, because your meter is reading all of this black, and it's trying to bring this black back to 50% gray. Because 50% gray is brighter than black, it's going to take your whole image and make your image over bright. So, Cass, does that make sense? Just shake your head. All right, got it. I'm gonna pick on Patricia pretty soon too, because Patricia's been hanging in there. I can see her. So, does that make sense, Patricia? Right? Just shake your head. Say yes, that makes sense to me. I got it. All right, good. So, here's the way that we solve that. Instead of metering here, what I'm going to do is take and imagine that I got my camera really close. So what happens if I were to bring my camera and put my camera right here and shine right on the bridge of her nose? And this is a foot away from my subject, right? And so essentially what that is doing is taking and doing this. Essentially, I am zooming in so that all my camera sees is this. And if my light meter is center weighted and pointed right here at the middle of this image, and then I were to go ahead and just put my blur and my desaturation on there, what am I metering now? As I start to meter now, I am actually metering, even if I were to use matrix metering, aren't those all much closer to 50% gray? So when we're using a camera and you want to actually get a proper exposure on someone who is outside or in natural light, and we all have been fooled by this, right? We take a light meter reading, we take the shot and we go, oh, that's the background looks terrific, but my subject is black. They're dark, right? In order to avoid that problem, we keep our camera set in manual mode. We turn our metering to spot metering, and we get really close to our subject. Say, let me get really close for a second. You zoom in, you get within a foot or two of your subject. You set your meter based upon her face from that close. And imagine that if I turn these off, we're going to get this close. So when we're looking through our viewfinder, we're seeing just her face. Then we do a meter reading, and we set our camera settings based upon that meter reading. Then we back off and then take that shot that we have framed and set up. But because we metered on only this portion of her face, our meter is not being fooled. The reflective meter that is built into the camera is not going to be fooled.
So do you have to be that close to it to make that work? Like you said, a foot away?
Well, you know, you can be 2 foot away depending on your lens. So if you've got a 70 to 200, you know, you can be 4 feet away. If you've got a 24 to 70 and you're shooting at, 40 millimeter or 50 millimeter, you may want to be within 2 feet away. All right. But the trick is to spot meter this close to the person's face. Once you've done that, you have the proper meter reading, and then you can back off and frame the shot any way you want. Just don't change your exposure. Okay. And it works really, really well for natural light portraiture when you're not using any strobes and you just want to try to get this beautiful light, but you don't want to overexpose or you don't want your subject being black. Now, what may happen in a natural light setting is that the background goes very, very bright. And so if you look at this shot, you see there's no detail in that sky. The sky is just totally blown out. But I have detail in my subject, right? So this is what matters. You know, nobody wants a silhouette shot of a bride standing with a beautiful background. It's not a great shot. So we need to either add light to it or we need to expose for the bride and not worry that the background is going to get blown out. So it's just a balancing act of how we do things. Let's take this shot, for example. This is my little buddy Finn when he was only about a year old or so. And he's on the front of the boat. Now I'm over here in Lightroom, and I wanted to show you this as part of tonight's class. And I know we're running long, so thank you for everybody that's hanging in there with me. But since we had a porn episode in the middle of it, I guess we can take a little more time. So in this shot, some people would say, Doug, you missed the shot, right? Finn is just too dark. But you notice that over here, I have a really bright white spots of this reflection of the water. He's sitting up at the front of my bow of my boat, and his favorite place to watch for ducks. And so this is what my meter is reading off of. And you see, if I look at my histogram is not blown out, but it is right there at the edge. Now I can make a decision in Lightroom afterwards to simply push the exposure more. And as I push the exposure more, I start to blow out these whites more. But now I can bring the shadows and open up those shadows. So I can do some things in here to open up the shadows and still not blow out my whites because I can pull my highlights and my whites back in Lightroom. Had I shot this for the exposure of Finn, I would have blown out the whites and I would have had no detail there. So if I reset this to the original, you'll see that one thing that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and you'll have to watch this, but in the develop module of Lightroom, if you see the histogram over here, as I watch underneath this histogram, right under here, as I bring my cursor onto the white, you see how it's giving me RGB values? You see that 94.8, 95.5, or 4, 95.7. Those values are the RGB value of that particular spot in my image. I will tell you that if you're into printing, you do not want to go above 95. If you try to print an RGB value above 95, it will lay no ink. And when you put it into a print, you will have a bare, basic white paper. There will be no ink laid down. And if you were to happen to put that into a competition light box and have somebody like me judge it, I'm going to say it is blown out. There is no detail in that white. But if you keep it below 95, there will be detail in that white. So we use that as an indicator for us to kind of balance our image. So one of the first things that we do when we start to develop an image is to take our cursor and look around at the image and say, here I'm at 2.2, 2.7, 2. And 3.5. Even though it looks like there's pure black, there is data there. There is data here. Not much, but there's data in these darks. And in the whites, I still have data. I'm not above 95, 96, so I did not blow the image out. So without having some sort of auxiliary light source on Finn, whether it be a reflector or a strobe or continuous light or an LED or the light off the back of my cell phone, I could have turned that on and given him a little bit of light in his face. But the last thing I wanted to do was have this go to pure white. So what I did was just accept the exposure where it was. I can now push the whole exposure, pull the highlights back, pull the whites back, get my highlights back so that you see it's still, see if I keep the whites here, watch the whites in here. You see how they're 96, 97, 98s. And if I pull this back a little bit more, you'll see it's 98, 98, 98. That's pure white. That means that there is no detail in this at all. So by pulling this highlight back, I'm able to keep that into a range that is printable, all below 95. All right, if I start to go a little bit high, like down here, I'm in a little bit high, I need to pull a little more highlights out. And then open up my shadows to bring Finn back into the photo. So you see there was lots of detail in here. I just didn't see it because my exposure was down. So where would my light meter have read? My light meter would have been, you know, my light meter, if I reset this, my light meter was probably reading really, really dark. I was probably at -2 on my light meter. But what I did was I watched my histogram. And this is why we like to have our histogram up on the back of our camera, because the light meter can be fooled. I didn't have time, you know, I'm driving a boat. So I didn't have time to go ahead and get close to Finn's face and take a light meter reading off of his face and then come back. What I assume is that I'm going to go dark, but I also look at my histogram quickly and make certain that I'm not blowing out here and know that I can pull some of this detail back. So this is going to be an important feature for us as we move forward, using that to develop and control our light meters. What we're going to be talking a little bit about in the second class is that we're going to be covering white balance. We're going to be covering color calibration and calibrating our, sorry, it's my other computer system went to sleep over here. So,
and Doug, it sounds like your audio went garbled again right there.
Is it back to normal again?
No, we're back to it's the garbled again.
Interesting. So what I'm going to do, how's that?
That works, but we lost your video now.
Oh, I can start video again. How's that?
There we are. Looks good.
All right. So, what next class we're going to talk about is kind of follow up on some of the things we covered here tonight. We're also going to cover some color calibration issues. We're going to calibrate our cameras so that our color renditions and our color attenuations are as close as possible. And I'll show you how to do that. And we're also going to be using quite regularly, we're going to be going back and looking at some of the functions that we do have and that we've used in Photoshop in order to balance our images. And that all comes down to, I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to go back over to Photoshop. So in Photoshop, we're going to use some of those same techniques for evaluating the light. And then we're also going to be using some of those techniques to, excuse me, evaluate the different qualities of light and quantities of light coming from multiple light sources. So whether we use this image or we use other images, we'll be evaluating multiple light sources and how we evaluate it. Now, in Photoshop, if those of you don't use Lightroom, we use the exact same thing over here as my info tool. You see my eyedropper? Watch my eyedropper as it goes around the subject. And if I were to zoom in on my subject, and this is a finished JPEG of this young lady. This is Rebecca. But if I look at the specular light in Rebecca's eyes, and I hover over the top of that specular light, you'll see my RGB values are sitting at around 204, 209, 220. On the RGB values, it's different in Photoshop than it is in Lightroom. Lightroom measures percentages. In Photoshop, we actually measure actual RGB values based on the 0 to 255 scale. So what I don't want to see is my specular highlight to go above 230, 225, somewhere in that range. If I go above 225, you'll see that it will give me a no detail in that white. So if I bring my lights back up here, so I just increase the exposure, and you see now I'm up into a higher range. It is going to start to blow out my values, my RGB values, and I will have no detail back in that. So we're going to watch that pretty carefully in Photoshop. We're also going to watch it in Lightroom as well. So I'm going to try to teach to both platforms. I know many of you are just Lightroom users. Many of you don't use Photoshop at all. I do some pretty advanced Photoshop classes as well that we'll see about getting offered here with Delaware. But I think this was a good starting point for us today. I'm going to jump into so I can see the chat here for a second, if there's any chat that I can see. And if so, are there questions that I need to be asking or answering, Steve?
No chat, no questions there. Just a couple questions. Make sure we share the PowerPoint after. People were looking for the exposure chart.
Yep. So what I'll do is we'll send that out in an email to everybody that participated. I'll send you that chart in a PDF document so you can have it and print it. It's something that I consider to be a foundational class for any photographer. We really need to understand that. And we'll build upon that each and every class. So that class, when we talk about buying light, I'm going to show you more in-camera sessions. We're going to be having multiple feeds and multiple cameras available for us as the sessions move forward. And I want everybody to remember to be thinking about those clicks on your camera. So even for you advanced users that are pro shooters, think about those camera clicks. Where am I, if I lose 3 stops of clicks on my one dial, do I buy them back on what other dial? Am I going to buy those clicks on? So as long as our cameras are set up, as long as those cameras are set up to be able to, you know, set up on 3rd clicks, that system works, and it works really, really, really well. No more spinning of dials, no more fumbling with, you know, which dial do I spin here? And I'm just looking for something that looks decent in my live view on the back of my camera. Those days should not be happening to us, all right? Those are amateur moves. We want to get you beyond that. So, Kavrashad said, use autofocus points to have your metering set to spot. It's a spot on the center of the image or on the autofocus point. If you set your camera in the menu system to use your autofocus point as your metering spot, it is set wherever the meter spot is. So if you had your meter spot set for a higher 3rd position and to the right, that's what the metering is going to be set off of. And that's only if you're using spot metering. So I hope that answers it. And is ISO generally the last exposure adjustment you make? Typically not. Nowadays, because we can buy so much light on our ISO that we couldn't before. So back, you know, in 2002, 2003, my ISO limit was maybe ISO 400 because the cameras were not very good high ISOs. Nowadays, I will routinely shoot at ISO 6400 with some of my cameras and be very comfortable with it. Now, I would not pull out a Canon 7D and shoot at ISO 6400. That camera maxes out at about an ISO 1000. But you will find, and we can evaluate that in classes moving forward, where you consider to be a reasonable ISO for your camera system. So, for example, a Canon 5D Mark IV is very comfortable at shooting up here at ISO 6400 without a problem. 12,800, we start to see some noise, but still not bad. My Fuji XT3, 6400, not a problem at all. My Olympus, I'm down into 1600. So I have the OMD EM1X, and I'm at 1600, maybe 32, 2500 range. But as I get up in the ISO on that micro 4/3 sensor, I start to lose quality. So everybody's going to have some parameters. We're going to start off with those parameters in the next class, so we'll talk a little more about that. And Faye wants to know when the next session date is. The next session is scheduled already with Eventbrite. Hopefully we will eliminate the annotations so we won't get porned out in the middle of this thing. I apologize again for that. It is so embarrassing.
2 weeks from today, again, 8 o'clock, next Wednesday.
And Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah, Wednesday, end of the month.
Good seeing you, Carl. Good seeing you, Patricia. I only see a couple of people on screen here, so I'm sorry I don't see everybody. I got John Zerfus, is he still here? Maybe Mark and Carl and Sharon is here. I see a bunch of people that I know, and thanks for coming out and putting up with our little bit of issues for the first part of the program. But hopefully we will get that straightened out, and in 2 weeks we'll do better.
So awesome, Doug. Thank you so much, and yeah, thank you everyone for bearing with us. It's a learning session all around, learning photography and learning other steps as well. So yeah, so the next class with Doug is in 2 weeks, Wednesday the 27th, and then the third class will be again 2 weeks following Wednesday the 3rd. Both classes scheduled at 8 o'clock. We do have a class next week on Wednesday with another great local photo educator, Bob Collignon. He's going to be doing a basic product photography class. So a lot of artists and craftspeople are stuck without craft shows and craft fairs to share their products. So he's going to do a basic class about photographing small products, product photography there. So status update on the store, Delaware Camera. We have a film drop box that is open. The lab is running. We are open for curbside pickup Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays from 10 till 3. By all means, reach out to us via email, Facebook, Instagram, however. You can call the store. Mark, who I believe is also still here, he's graciously forwarding all of the calls that go to the store to himself. So even if it's not one of those 10 to 3 hours, you can generally get a reply or leave a message and he can get back to you. So again.
And Steve, just wanted to mention, if anybody needs particular questions answered or whatever, you can reach out to me, just doug@hansgate.com. Pretty easy to remember, doug@hansgate.com. If you have a specific question about something I covered, feel free to email me. I can, oftentimes answer something pretty quickly and give you a quick answer to something. And, we can even arrange, I can, sign onto your computer and take over your computer and help with some imaging questions. If we have to do that, we can arrange to do that. I do that quite frequently for people around the country. So don't be afraid to reach out to me, and hope everybody enjoyed it. Other than our little bit of sexcapade in the middle there, we're good.
Yeah, so yes, the questions, we will be sending a follow-up email with the PDF. I do also have a recording of the class that I'm going to certainly edit down that we can share as needed. And we'll have links to the future classes in that email as well. So, and if you are not registered, please send me a private message with your email address, and I will make sure that your email gets into the registration link. If you registered for this class on Eventbrite, you should be all set.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye now. Bye, Kath. Bye, Faye.